All right, it is noontime on the East Coast of the United States of America, so it's C-Star time. My name is Dirk den Ouden. Welcome, audience, for the second lecture in our new season, the 2022-2023 season. As we are in Colombia, it looks as if Hurricane Ian will largely bypass us, but our colleagues in Charleston are bracing themselves at the moment for what is to come. So we wish everybody all the best who has been or is in the path of this storm. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to talk to you briefly about the talk in 2 weeks. So put that on your schedules as well. October 14th, we'll have Brady Williamson from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, and he'll be talking about optimal grading and segmentation of enlarged perivascular spaces. And that's also something that some of the people of our team here at C-Star are working on. So we're all very interested in that talk. Today, however, it gives me great pleasure once again to introduce my friend and colleague, William Matchin. He has spoken to us before as part of this series, but he will do so again today. William got his PhD in 2014 from the University of California at Irvine. And then after some postdoctoral work, he joined us here at the University of South Carolina in 2018. And he is a collaborator as well on our current C-Star team. He is a cognitive neuroscientist and a linguist, and some of his latest work includes development of the dual stream model of language for syntax. So that model is getting some traction, and I'm sure he'll spend some time, I think, talking about that as well today. He'll be discussing his work under the title, The Wernicke Conundrum Revisited. And with that, I'm going to give the floor to William.
Hope you can hear me okay. Thank you, Dirk, for the introduction and for having me. Sorry to not see people in person today. We've had this hurricane, I suppose is the right word to call it, that's affecting us right now. So we're doing this all remotely, but glad to be here talking about this work with you anyway. Okay, so let's get started. So as Dirk mentioned, I'll be talking about the Wernicke Conundrum Revisited. And so this work, in some sense, is a response to a paper, a very interesting paper by Mesulam and colleagues. So it was published a few years ago called The Wernicke Conundrum and the Anatomy of Language Comprehension in Primary Progressive Aphasia. And so we published this paper titled The Wernicke Conundrum Revisited, and we're looking at stroke-based aphasia and sort of investigating some of the hypotheses and ideas that were raised in this original work. And I was honored to have, when we posted the paper as a preprint, Dr. Mesulam actually wrote a review of our paper on this website, which I had never heard of before. I'm not sure how to pronounce the title. I feel like if you're going to create new websites, you should have them follow the sort of orthographic constraints of the language that you want people to pronounce it in. I'm assuming it's like Queos, but there should definitely be a U in there somewhere. So we wrote a review, and I was kind of entertaining because the system has a star rating system, kind of like Yelp or like Google reviews. So he gave us a 2 out of a 5-star maximum. So I think that's in general, I feel like that's a pretty bad rating, when I'm reviewing abstracts and other works, or papers for a journal, right? Like typically you're not going to say the work is 2 out of 5 stars. So, I'm very curious. I was sort of honored to have the attention and very curious to hear what his thoughts were. What were they? Let's take a look. So one thing he mentioned is that the study is conducted by world leaders in neurolinguistics on a large cohort of well-characterized patients with state-of-the-art imaging methodologies. So that started off pretty good. But a lot of the objections were, well, that this is in stroke-based aphasia, that there's some misunderstandings and confused logic, and advised us to withdraw the paper and do more constructive thinking. So I would like to, throughout this talk, I'll introduce the logic behind it and the argumentation, and well, I'd love to hear your feedback and responses on this work. So yeah, what I don't want to do though is to basically argue with somebody who's not present. So I'm just going to present this work as straightforwardly as I can, and would love to hear any feedback and responses. But I don't want to just sort of yell at an empty chair and ask questions that can't be responded to effectively. So starting off, I'm going to be looking at, well, a major component of the Wernicke Conundrum is the question of sentence and word comprehension deficits in aphasia. So looking at stroke-based aphasia, lesion-symptom mapping methodology, which has emerged in the last 20 years or so, has enabled us to, in a more statistically rigorous manner, look at the correlations between different patterns of deficits and locations of brain damage that are associated with those deficits. So I don't probably need to review this very much, but modern lesion symptom mapping studies of word comprehension deficits have found that posterior temporal and sometimes temporal parietal damage is primarily associated with word comprehension deficits, which is consistent with observations that go back to the 1800s. From the classic neurologists like Wernicke up through the 20th century, people had observed that some posterior temporal area, which we might vaguely refer to as Wernicke's area, is involved in comprehension at the word level. If we look at other aspects of language, for example, at expressive agrammatism, which is a common symptom of Broca's aphasia, or non-fluent aphasia that has some characteristic deficits, often including agrammatism, which is this sort of syntactic simplification, omission of functional elements. And if you look at lesion mapping studies looking at expressive agrammatism, we find that it's highly associated with damage to the frontal lobe, including Broca's area, although it's of course a more complicated picture. But both in stroke-based and even in primary progressive aphasia, we find this association of agrammatic deficits and frontal damage or degeneration. And looking at sentence comprehension, if you try to, well, one of my major interests is in syntax, which is, of course, the hierarchical structure of sentences. And looking at syntactic comprehension turns out to be a bit more complex. And I'm not going to really dive into that today, unless people have questions or are interested in that. But we try to get at syntactic comprehension in aphasia by using this standard paradigm, looking at non-canonical sentences. So these are typically with, object first sentences like passives, object relatives, object clefs, etc., object WH questions. These are more complex sentences, and there's a large body of literature suggesting that you require syntactic resources and able to comprehend those sentences. So we did a recent lesion symptom mapping study, and looking at expressive agrammatism, we find that that's primarily associated with frontal lesions. Syntactic comprehension deficits are associated primarily with posterior temporal lobe lesions, which is consistent with, again, the historical neurological research on this topic. And we find that these things doubly dissociate, right? The comprehension deficits associated with posterior temporal damage and not frontal damage, and the reverse for expressive agrammatism. So putting all of these findings and many more findings from lesion symptom mapping, from functional neuroimaging, taking a look at some of the neuroimaging literature, functional neuroimaging literature in healthy subjects. So on the left here, this is an fMRI study from Ev Fedorenko and colleagues, where they were interested in looking at word and syntactic level processing, contrasting, for example, real sentences to Jabberwocky sentences, which basically don't have as many real words, but still preserve this sort of syntactic structure and sort of nature of the sentence. Or comparing, for example, real words to non-words. And so these activate, this sort of contrast activates a lot of language-related areas, but it includes very prominently this posterior temporal lobe region, right? So word level processing, when you compare stimuli that have real words with those containing pseudo words, you get increased activation in posterior temporal lobe, among other areas, right? So this is consistent with the neurological picture of word comprehension deficits in this area. But if you do syntactic-based comparisons, and primarily I'm interested in this contrast between Jabberwocky sentences, which preserve the syntactic structure of a sentence, but really don't have the conceptual semantic content, to non-words, you find this increased activation for Jabberwocky in frontal cortex and posterior temporal lobe, right? These are the two primary regions that pop up. So, and this is on the right here, this is just using Neurosynth, which is a meta-analysis tool that looks at previously published studies and using keywords. If you type in lexical and syntactic, you find, again, this sort of parasylbian thing, including the posterior temporal lobe where these overlap. Right, so there's this robust overlap of lexical and syntactic effects in this area. This area is associated with both word and sentence level comprehension deficits in lesion symptom mapping studies in chronic stroke-based aphasia. So if you put all of this stuff together with a lot of other data, a lot of other considerations, this is the sort of foundation of the model that I recently published with Gregory Hickok. And we posit different regions that are engaged in different aspects of linguistic processing, but a critical nature or a critical feature of this model is that this posterior middle temporal gyrus, superior temporal sulcus region in green here, we posit that it's really critical for both word and sentence level processing. And if you look at the psycholinguistic and theoretical syntax literatures, for really multiple decades now, this concept of lexicalized syntax, or the idea that, for example, syntactic information is really critical to what a lexical item is. So take a noun or a verb, it's syntactic category information, verbs with different argument structure properties that indicate how that verb can combine with other parts of the sentence. And so basically, we posit this integrated hierarchical lexical syntactic function in this posterior middle temporal gyrus, superior temporal sulcus region. That's the critical sort of feature of this model, I think, that's relevant for this investigation, right? So there's good reasons from both the stroke-based lesion symptom mapping literature and the functional neuroimaging literature to think that there's this kind of lexical syntactic function of this posterior temporal lobe region. And if you were tuning into the most recent C-STAR lecture by Stephen Wilson, he presented data from one of his trainees, I believe her name is Sarah Schneck. This is work looking at recovery of aphasia, recovery of chronic aphasia. And what they find is that if you look at functional activation to a language mapping task, and ask what kinds of activations explain recovery in aphasia above and beyond the effect of the lesion itself, then what you find is that it's the posterior temporal lobe activation that predicts that, right? Pretty singularly in terms of all other potential regions that could have been implicated, right? So this region not only does damage predict deficits, including critically in comprehension, but residual activation, which may be an index of functionality that's not necessarily captured by the lesion, right? That is also very indicative of aphasia recovery. And I believe that this will be presented at Neurobiology of Language next week. So I think I really look forward to this talk. And I just, I love this area. This area just shows up in everything that we look at. It seems to be the most critical area. It was kind of funny when Stephen was presenting, because he was, sort of saying like, oh yeah, this is like the real language region, right? We used to think we had two language regions, Broca's area and the posterior temporal lobe. And, people have started arguing, right, there's a much more complex network, which of course we agree, right? Phonological and semantic processing involve widely distributed areas. But if you look at these sort of core linguistic functions, it really seems to kind of boil down to the posterior temporal lobe, right? There's really like this one major language-related region in the brain. So everything is great. This, Wernicke's area is awesome. It does everything. But then there are certain pieces of data that seem to be quite mysterious once you start thinking about them. In particular, I'm talking about logopenic primary progressive aphasia. And this is the kind of data that really, I believe, motivated the concepts that Dr. Mesulam promulgated in this paper and series of works regarding this Wernicke conundrum, right? So if you look at logopenic PPA, this is one subcategory of primary progressive aphasia that has certain kinds of deficits like repetition, could be naming deficits, could be maybe some sentence comprehension deficits. But if you look at word comprehension, this is measured by the WAB in this study, you see it's actually pretty good overall for most of these individual cases that are reported here, right? So in these are, let's see, okay. Yeah, these are scans that show the top four here are atrophy, and the bottom two cases here, this is perfusion. But you see that all 6 of these cases have pretty serious dysfunction or degeneration of the posterior temporal lobe. This looks almost exactly like the region that I showed here, or this region here, right? Look at case 2, right? This is a pretty severe Wernicke's area atrophy, but yet that case number 2 has 100% word comprehension abilities, which is pretty shocking if that region is critical for word comprehension. So this is, in some sense, a big source of the conundrum that we're talking about here, right? The stroke-based literature really calls attention to the posterior temporal lobe, roughly Wernicke's area, as being critically involved in word comprehension deficits, but the PPA literature does not point to that, if you look particularly at these logopenic patients here. So I remember actually being at the talk in Boston at CNS in 2014, where Dr. Mesulam presented this work. I remember being super impressed. It was very exciting and interesting. And if you actually, unfortunately, the CNS talk was not, I couldn't find this online, but this is a really great presentation at OHBM from 2017 that gives a very good overview of this perspective and a review of the relevant literature. So I highly recommend taking a look at this talk. It's very cogently presented. Calling attention to this issue, right? So what is the hypothesis? So the hypothesis from Mesulam et al. Is that there's a disconnection effect going on in the stroke-based Wernicke's aphasia literature, right? So the idea here is a stroke within one of these vascular territories, roughly associated with Wernicke's area, can not only destroy the cortex and interfere with the phonological function, but can also cause white matter destruction that disconnects other parts of the brain from each other that are critical for various aspects of language. And so the idea is that in stroke, what's causing Wernicke's aphasia is not so much the cortical damage, the gray matter damage itself, but the disconnection that damage does to the rest of the language network. So in this general idea, this idea of a disconnection syndrome was sort of called attention to with this paper by Catani and Mesulam in 2008, which sort of reviewed this concept in the context of the arcuate fasciculus. And so what they discuss is that if you look at the classical neurologists and Geschwin in the 20th century, disconnection was a central theme of their explanations of various linguistic deficits. The idea that not only damage to individual centers would cause a particular deficit, but disconnection. For example, the disconnection between this is A here is, I like how in Lichtheim's model, A, this is Wernicke's area, which is also A in Wernicke's model, but it's W in Geschwin's model. But then Geschwin has A, which is the angular gyrus, and B for Broca's area, but B is Broca's area in Wernicke's model, but it's M. That's Broca's area in Lichtheim's model. But okay, the connection between A and M in Lichtheim's model between Wernicke's area and Broca's area, right? That's the arcuate fasciculus. Damage to that would give you conduction aphasia, which is primarily repetition deficits and other potential corrective deficits like phonological errors that patients struggle to correct and exhibit this characteristic conduit d'approche symptomology, right? So disconnection was a central theme. And so they sort of revived this in saying, look, you're doing lesion symptom mapping studies. You've got multiple patients, and maybe there's maximum overlap from those patients in a particular area. But it may not be the case that this maximum overlap is really causally implicated in deficits if what's causing the deficit is the disconnection, potentially for long-range fibers. So if you can imagine here, a long-range fiber passing through this entire territory, a lesion in each of these locations can cause disconnection, a similar kind of disconnection. And those can actually potentially be responsible for the deficits that we're seeing and not the maximum area of overlap, right? So there might be something misleading about our lesion symptom mapping studies or the classical sort of neurological associations that we would see between a deficit and damage to an area, right? And this makes a lot of sense, right? We know how important white matter pathways are for processing. Disconnection is certainly a critical aspect of understanding neurological disorders. So going back to Wernicke's aphasia and the idea that both word and sentence level or syntactic comprehension deficits are characteristic of Wernicke's aphasia, what they suggest, or what Mesulam et al. Suggest here, is that the dorsal axis of the disconnection caused by damage to Wernicke's area disconnects Broca's area and frontal cortex from other parts of the brain. And the idea is that, well, Broca's area is important for syntax. If you damage the white matter pathways that disconnect Broca's area from other areas, that makes a patient seem like they have a syntactic problem, even though the syntactic processing resources might be intact in Broca's area, which is where they suggest that this processing happens, right? And then likewise, for word comprehension, they suggest that the anterior temporal lobe is really the critical area for word comprehension, but that a stroke to Wernicke's area may cut off the anterior temporal lobe from other areas, leading to the word comprehension deficits, right? So what they really think is that there's two disconnection features in Wernicke's aphasia. Well, this is where we get the term double disconnection. So you can see the idea here. This is a model that they published here saying that, look, you've got Wernicke's area, and then you've got fibers that go from Broca's area to other areas and anterior temporal lobe to other areas, and they pass through Wernicke's area, right? So if you destroy Wernicke's area or damage it, right, then you can impair these pathways, which lead to sentence level and word level deficits from disconnection of these two centers. But they talk about how in primary progressive aphasia, the virtue of looking at PPA is that typically what you see is degeneration of gray matter without a serious impingement on white matter, as far as I understand it. So neurodegeneration in Wernicke's cortex destroys the neurons, but not the fibers passing through that area, right? So you might be able to more cleanly look at what's the function of Wernicke's area itself, leaving these connections intact, right? So what do you see if you have degeneration of Wernicke's area without destruction of those crossing fibers, right? So this is exemplified in the PPA literature, which I discussed a little bit before, but this is a case study from Mesulam's paper, right? This is a patient with severe degeneration of, I think by anyone's definition, right, the areas in and around Wernicke's area, but with very good word level comprehension. Right. So the idea here is that PPA is sort of a cleaner way to look at this. Yeah, I'm going to skip through this. It's just, it's interesting that this sort of idea of a double disconnection actually was also proposed, not double disconnection, but the idea of syntactic comprehension deficits in aphasia were also brought up by Karamatsa and Zurif in this classic study from 1976, where they noticed here that people with conduction aphasia also showed putative syntactic comprehension deficits, which they attributed to disconnection. Anyway, so in Mesulam's study, they had a big sample of people with primary progressive aphasia. And what they show here is that using the Peabody picture vocabulary test and a test of non-canonical sentence comprehension that limits lexical processing demands, they showed a lack of correlation in PPA. And what they do show, though, is that sentence comprehension is correlated with repetition deficits, which may point to some shared underlying resources there, like working memory, but not shared between word and sentence comprehension. And then with respect to the neurodegeneration patterns, what they find is that word comprehension deficits were really primarily associated with anterior temporal lobe degeneration, and sentence comprehension deficits were associated with frontal parietal degeneration, right? Consistent with this double disconnection idea that the real syntactic deficits are due to this pattern of degeneration or disruption of processing in those areas. Word comprehension deficits due to disruption of processing in the anterior temporal area, right? So the claim here, right? The idea is that the neural substrates of word and sentence comprehension are dissociable, and that a circumscribed cortical area equally critical for word and sentence comprehension is unlikely to exist anywhere in the cerebral cortex. Wah, wah, wah. For everything I talked about earlier in the talk, I love Wernicke's area. I think it's the most important area. It's, underlies the lexicon, hierarchical syntax. Maybe it's sort of like a lot of the core aspects of language are wrapped up in this area. And this claim is sort of, actually, it's really not that important for those aspects of language. So one thing is that Catani and Mesulam in their 2008 paper discussing the disconnection theme, what they point out is that, well, DTI is probably going to be really important because we can use that to look at pathways and look at disconnection, and we can use that to get productive insights into connectivity and disconnection syndromes. So, taking that to heart, we decided to look at that in stroke, right? This is very interesting claims coming from PPA. Now let's ask the question, right? Is it actually the case that this is what's going on, right? That in stroke-based aphasia, the deficits, the comprehension deficits that we're seeing are primarily due to disconnection of other areas and not damage to Wernicke's area. So that's what we asked using DTI, right? So with connectome-based lesion symptom mapping, what we do is we collect DTI data in stroke patients and do probabilistic tractography. And basically, we come with a measure of reciprocal connection strength among pairs of regions that we're looking at. So in this study, we're basically looking at the whole brain, and we have a measure of connection strength as measured through diffusion tensor imaging that basically looks at the number of fibers, white matter fibers that can be tracked from one area to another. I'm happy to answer questions about this method later if you'd like. And then we do lesion symptom mapping in the normal way, right? We relate the degree of connection strength to the behavioral deficits that we observe in the patient group, right? So, and this is just to show you that CLSM provides additional information relative to lesions. So this is a nice paper by Leo Bonilla, who's a co-author on this work, who kind of helped to advance this methodology. And basically what they show here is that in a lesion symptom mapping study, if they include both the lesion, like damage to different areas, the lesion effect, and the disconnection effect, they find a significant effect of the disconnection on top of the effect of the lesion, right? And this is just another paper from Julius Friedrichsen and colleagues, who's also a co-author on this work. If you look at the disconnection patterns of various deficits in aphasia, you see here that there's additional information. There's disconnection patterns that may not have been obvious from the effect of the lesion that are likely explaining some of the deficits that we're seeing, in addition to the gray matter damage itself. So this sort of works, just another way of saying that. So in the study, what we have is a variety of behavioral measures. We have the Western Aphasia Battery. In particular, we're looking at auditory word recognition and the repetition tasks. We're kind of doing a conceptual replication of Mesulam et al., right? With some minor differences in methodology. And of course, the major difference being we're looking at chronic stroke-based aphasia rather than PPA, right? And then we're using CLSM to test, to investigate this double disconnection hypothesis, right? Is it actually the case that in stroke-based aphasia, we can explain those word and sentence comprehension deficits through disconnection rather than the lesion to Wernicke's area? Right. So as I mentioned, we have the WAB-R, auditory word recognition, repetition, non-canonical sentence comprehension from the NAVs, which is the same measure that Mesulam et al. Used. Pyramids and palm trees. So Mesulam et al. Used the pyramids and palm trees, which is a non-linguistic measure of conceptual semantic processing abilities, and probably some other things like executive function. People have to match pictures based on their meaning. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about that later, but they use that as a covariate with auditory word recognition to hone that measure in more on linguistic processing rather than the ability to like recognize objects in the environment. And then we have a perceptual assessment of expressive agrammatism, which we had published in previous studies, where basically we just have a clinical sort of judgment as to whether the patient presents with expressive agrammatism or not. Okay, so these are our primary measures. We had overlapping numbers of subjects in each of these groups. So for the full set of subjects that we had WAB data for, we had 218 and 199 that we had CLSM. We had basically the DTI data, which allowed us to do CLSM. And so you can see here for the non-canonical sentence comprehension, we had 130, 127 in the CLSM. Those are really the two major ones here. In the pyramids and palm trees, we had 180 total, 167 in CLSM. So I reckon you can take a look at this paper if you want to see the numbers, in details there, but we had large numbers of subjects for all of our analyses. So if we replicate the behavioral analyses that Mesulam et al. Performed, what we find here is that, so here's word comprehension and here's non-canonical comprehension. We find that these are significantly correlated with a reasonable correlation coefficient. And this was not significant in the previous analysis, but significant here, which is no surprise, right? We know that in Wernicke's aphasia, chronic stroke-based aphasia, that they tend to have words and sentence comprehension deficits. So the fact that these measures are correlated is what we expect to find. Yeah, expressive agrammatism in this analysis was also correlated with word comprehension deficits, which may be surprising in the sense our model suggests that the frontal-based cortex is really not critical for comprehension, but does cause expressive agrammatism when damaged. So this may be a little bit surprising, but when we include lesion volume as a covariate, which is an important covariate because people with frontal lesions tend to have much bigger patterns of damage, then we find that this correlation is no longer significant. But the word and sentence comprehension correlation remains significant there. So in a nutshell, we basically kind of replicate the Mesulam behavioral results, but we have this significant correlation here now between word and sentence comprehension that was not significant before, which makes sense. If we look at the lesion results, the top row here, this is just the lesion overlap map for each of the each of the 4 different groups with different numbers of subjects. The second row here, these are corrected voxel-wise lesion symptom mapping analyses. So we include lesion volume as a covariate, which is important to correctly identify the spatial distribution associated with the lesion. And here's the word comprehension measure, which is auditory word recognition with the pyramids and palm trees as a covariate to hone in on word level linguistic processing. We find here that this is middle STG and posterior STS going into the MTG, which is consistent with previous results. We see a similar distribution for non-canonical sentence comprehension deficits, which is also similar to some previous results in stroke-based aphasia. For repetition, we get some posterior temporal parietal stuff, including the white matter medial to the surface, which is basically the arcuate fasciculus. Again, makes sense from the literature, and expressive agrammatism is mostly frontal, which again makes sense and is previously reported. These are just the bottom row here are reduced threshold analyses at P01 just to give you a broader sense of the lesion distributions here. There's no, for example, for word sense comprehension, there's no, subthreshold frontal effects, for example. Now, when we look at the overlap of word and sentence comprehension, basically what we find is they overlap in the middle posterior temporal lobe, right? And again, this is not terribly surprising, but this sort of just reinforces that in chronic stroke-based aphasia, these things do coincide, right? This is the unsmooth version of this overlap. So you can see here, it's a bit splotchy and there's not perfect overlap, but you can see here, there's different numbers of subjects, these different analyses, right? So this is actually, coincident in the STS and the STG. But when you smooth it a little bit, you see there's very good overlap. And so, in a sense, we can kind of think of this as like the updated Wernicke's area based on lesion-symptom mapping, to the extent that we like to use that terminology, Wernicke's aphasia. So for our CLSM, these are the regions. We're using the JHU Atlas to look at patterns of connection strength between pairs of these regions. So just looking at these numbers here, you get a sense of what these different regions are. And these are the CLSM results, right? So what we're doing here is looking at all of the regions in the atlas, the pairwise connection strength between those regions associated with deficits on each task. And this is not including lesion volume as a covariate. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about that later if you'd like. So for word comprehension, you see disconnection throughout the temporal parietal lobes, inferior parietal lobe, including the anterior temporal lobe, right? So this is like the temporal pole of the middle temporal gyrus. And in some sense, this is kind of capturing a little bit of what Mesulam et al. Were talking about, right? If you look at the lesion results, you don't see a lot of anterior temporal lobe damage associated with word comprehension deficits, but we do see these significant disconnections involving anterior temporal areas. So that maybe suggests that those areas are helping people to understand the meaning of words, which we think is a perfectly reasonable idea. And for non-canonical sense comprehension, we also get some disconnections in the temporal parietal lobes, but some additional parietal lobe-based disconnections that we think this is probably indicating phonological processing resources in the inferior parietal lobe that may support non-canonical sentence comprehension because these are more complex, difficult sentences. But otherwise, it's somewhat similar to word comprehension. Repetition, you get everything, which is not terribly surprising, given damage to like white matter tracts here. So not a surprising result for repetition. And for expressive agrammatism, we get a significant disconnection basically within Broca's area, which suggests that, basically it's sort of replicating the lesion result here. The disconnection within that frontal cortex is also explanatory of deficits, which would make sense. So for non-canonical sense comprehension, this was really our critical test because the concept from Mesulam et al. Was that the non-canonical deficits that we see in Wernicke's aphasia are not due to damage to Wernicke's area, but rather disconnection of the frontal lobe. But yet we did not see any significant frontal disconnections in our CLSM analyses. So at a very first pass, this casts doubt on that explanation. Because if frontal disconnections were really driving the effect, rather than the damage to Wernicke's area, then you would expect to see disconnections, right? So that's one of the main results. But then you could ask the question, well, you're thresholding, maybe there are subthreshold disconnections that are really explaining what's going on. And you can see that there are, right? I'm just mapping here reduced threshold frontal-based disconnections, right? There are some reduced threshold frontal-based disconnections for non-canonical sense comprehension deficits. So then a further question you could ask is, well, do those really explain the comprehension deficits that you're seeing in Wernicke's aphasia or damage to that posterior temporal lobe region? Right, so the idea here is, again, to reiterate Mesulam et al.'s idea is that the disconnections are the explanation for the association of damage to Wernicke's area with word and sentence comprehension deficits, right? So the question here is not, are there disconnections, for example, of the anterior temporal lobe for word comprehension, or disconnection, or maybe subthreshold disconnections of frontal lobe associated with sentence comprehension deficits? The question is, do those disconnections explain the lesion effects that show up in Wernicke's area? So what we do basically is, well, we test that by including disconnection strength, or the degree of disconnection, or connection strength, if you want to think about it that way, as a covariate in the model. And then we ask the question, do we still get a lesion effect when we incorporate disconnection strength as a covariate, right? What is the lesion effect above and beyond the effect of disconnection? And basically, we take the single strongest disconnection for each of those measures and perform the analysis. So for word comprehension, we looked at these two areas here, PSTG, PMTG, when including this disconnection between the anterior MTG and occipital lobe, right? So this was the strongest disconnection, one of the strongest disconnection for word comprehension. And what we find is we still get a very robust lesion effect in these areas. So these lesions are still explaining behavior, even when accounting for this disconnection. Likewise, here for the more anterior parts of STG and MTG, we look at this disconnection, right, between the pole of the MTG and occipital cortex. And then we find is we still, again, get robust effects for these lesions above and beyond the disconnection of this line here. And then for non-canonical sentence comprehension, what we do here is we look at the strongest subthreshold frontal disconnection that we could find, which was between the IFG pars orbitalis and the cuneus, right? So this disconnection here, which wasn't significant when we corrected, but was just subthreshold, right? All four of these areas, lesions to them were still very robust, even when accounting for the strength of this disconnection, right? So basically, the lesions still explain a huge, well, they're still highly significant, even when accounting for the effect of disconnection, right? So this casts doubt on the disconnection hypothesis. So yeah, that's kind of this analysis was suggested by a reviewer. So I'm very thankful to whoever that reviewer was that suggested this analysis. In terms of Wernicke's area, like going back to Wernicke's area, right? One of the things that Mesulam and colleagues raised, which is the fact that Wernicke's area is all over the place. People don't really even know where, I typically define that as the posterior STG, but if you look at our lesion results, right, it was really more like the middle STG and posterior STS and maybe a little bit of the MTG, right? This is in terms of our analysis of if we define Wernicke's area as lesions that cause both word and sentence comprehension deficits, this is probably, a reasonable idea of where that should be. But interestingly, if you go back to one of Wernicke's models, this is from 1881, right? What you see here is that the STG implication goes much more anterior than just the posterior STG, right? It's really the middle and posterior STG. And you can see very clearly here, right? It goes through the sulcus, it gets a little bit of the MTG. So I find it just kind of entertaining that our lesion symptom mapping results look like very similar to Wernicke's model from 1881. So that's kind of cool. Like maybe Wernicke was kind of right about that. And so, yeah, in general, the term Wernicke's area is probably not a good term to use because this nice study by Tremblay and Dick basically just found that authors, when they polled scientists, relevant scientists in neurobiology of language, right, they're all over the place in terms of their endorsement of different definitions of Wernicke's area. We probably shouldn't be using that word. We know it's more complex than that. There are different functions associated with different regions. And so probably the best thing to do here is have a detailed functional anatomical model of language that has a very detailed, explanation of different regions anatomically based that explain, how language works in the brain. Yeah, well, there's still this conundrum, right? So I think when in the review that Mesulam wrote was that, look, there's still a conundrum regardless of the stroke-based results. Why is it the case that in PPA, you see word comprehension in ATL and sentence comprehension deficits in frontal parietal degeneration, right? Why? This is the conundrum, right? This difference is the conundrum, which we don't explain in our analysis, which I think is a fair comment. So one thing is that in the PPA analyses, they use the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. So as of their word comprehension measure, but it's actually fairly difficult. So this is an example item that would have been used in their analysis where the auditory presentation is citrus and the patient has to select number 2, right? That requires a bit more finer grained semantic analysis. So then the WAB-R, where the WAB-R is like, oh, point to the desk, right? They're in a real environment and they're much more high frequency, simple vocabulary items. So probably the PPVT is much more heavily loaded on semantics, and the WAB-R focuses more on lexical access instead, right? That may explain why the ATL effect here is so robust, because we know that the ATL is implicated in retrieval of conceptual semantic features, especially detailed ones. Also, one thing that goes on in primary progressive aphasia is that the areas of peak atrophy are not sufficient to explain disrupted processing in the brain. So if you look at functional connectivity data, there's a variety of papers out on this topic. What they show is, for example, in the semantic variant PPA, and the atrophy in semantic variant is heavily loaded on the ATL. What you see is disrupted functional connectivity in other areas. So it may be the case that those kinds of patients struggle with the task because there's some other subtle neuropathology going on that's affecting a broader network, but the peak atrophy is still in ATL. So another way of saying this is PPA is probably more complicated than this picture of, look, there's just atrophy of focal, gray matter, which shows up in our measurements, and that's the sort of main explanation of what's going on. There's probably more widespread effects that may explain some of the deficits and patterns that we see in these patient groups. Logopenia and PPA, right, is still kind of surprising, even incorporating that fact, because this is where the peak atrophy is, right? If Wernicke's area is such an important, if the posterior middle temporal lobe is a super important area for comprehension, then you would expect that atrophy to this area should cause some pretty severe word comprehension deficits. And that's just not what you see. But it's important to look at the picture longitudinally, because what we find here is that when you look longitudinally, this is a nice study by Faria and colleagues, what they show is that this middle temporal area, which is basically the Wernicke's area region of interest in this study, is very significant when looking at the evolution of the syndrome over time, right? So as the syndrome gets worse, we see that the relationship between atrophy to posterior temporal areas and word comprehension deficits becomes significant. And you can see this here in a case study that Mesulam et al. Reported, where at time 0.1, with the ATL atrophy, right, actually word comprehension was pretty good. So this case, in some sense, right, you would say, actually, this kind of is surprising from the perspective of the Mesulam et al. Hypothesis. But when you look and see how the syndrome progresses, now it's incorporating also middle posterior temporal lobe areas. Now the word comprehension is pretty severely impaired. So that's an important aspect to think about. So anyway, Wernicke was probably right about a lot of stuff, including, the concept of a unified syndrome that had, comprehension deficits due to damage to this posterior temporal area. He may have been right that in this model, at least, the localization was middle and posterior STG and STS, which is basically what we find. Yeah, so that's cool. Yeah, so here's some overall conclusions. Word and non-canonical sentence comprehension deficits coincide with damage to middle posterior temporal lobe in stroke-based aphasia. Using CLSM analyses, we provide evidence against the Mesulam et al. Double disconnection hypothesis. Differences in localization of word and sentence comprehension deficits between stroke-based aphasia and PPA may be in part due to more complicated factors in PPA, such as altered cortical functionality in other areas that are not peak areas of atrophy. Precise definition of Wernicke's area, it probably needs to incorporate the middle temporal lobe, not just the very posterior part of the STG or MTG, right? Middle-ish parts of the temporal lobe are probably critical if you're thinking about areas involved in comprehension. Yeah, Wernicke's area, if you define it that way, it probably supports phonological and lexical syntactic mechanisms. Or another way of thinking about this is sort of like the main linguistic mechanisms that we think are involved in language. Okay, so here's just some acknowledgements of my co-authors and our funding from the NIDCD, and of course the C-STAR collaboration, which this sort of began as a bit of a pandemic project, and looking at the data that we had available and the questions that we could ask with that data. So it's just fortunate to be part of a super productive and knowledgeable team to help with all of this work. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, William. That was great. You can hear the audience clapping virtually, obviously. So thanks a lot for your talk. We have questions coming in already, so I'm going to read those out to you. The first one is from Deborah Levy. Given the PPA stroke discrepancies, do you have thoughts on whether data from resective neurosurgeries near these PSTG or ATL regions could help provide a complementary perspective? What might you expect to see in terms of language comprehension post-operatively?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great, I'm not super familiar with resection, but the prediction would be that you resect the areas that we think are important and you should see deficits, right? And so that's actually a great point that you make, right? Because the strokes are always messy. We include disconnection as a covariate, but there are plenty of methodological questions you would have about that, right? Did you fully account for disconnection? Did you appropriately measure connection strength using DTI, right? Which is not infallible. So resection could be very interesting because you can kind of like the thing that Mesulam et al. Point out about PPA, right? Why they're so interested in that syndrome for this question is you can look at the gray matter atrophy without the corresponding disconnection effects in theory, right? But of course it's messy. So resection should be a cleaner way to look at that. And I would be very interested to know, I don't really know the literature, like what happens if posterior middle temporal lobe is resected, right? I guess the thing is it's really not often resected, I'm guessing, because I feel like neurologists sort of know, right? Okay, don't resect Wernicke's area. But I'd be very curious to know what the data are.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question from our very own Roger Newman-Norland, who works with us on the C-STAR team here. PPA is a progressive disease allowing for possibly some types of correction, including neural rewiring as it slowly progresses, whereas stroke is acute. One day it happens and it happens quickly. Mm-hmm. Might this difference explain differences in neural correlates or other results?
I think it's certainly a possibility. I mean, I think people are very interested in the concept of functional reorganization in stroke. So, it is true that in the acute phase, I mean, acute studies could be interesting as well to look at for these reasons, right? We're looking in chronic stage. So there's certainly the possibility of reorganization, but with PPA, because the degeneration is so gradual, maybe there's greater possibility for functional reorganization. I don't really know off the top of my head, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. I just don't know if it's much more of a possibility in PPA compared to stroke. I mean, I take the point, right? The gradual effect might be more conducive to reorganization, but I don't know.
So there's a response from R.G. Hillis as well. She agrees with Roger. Like in slow-growing tumor, most surgical patients, there's often some or a lot of reorganization that takes place. So other areas can support word comprehension, at least for a while in PPA.
Thanks, R.G.
Yeah, we have a few other comments to get back at you. Deborah Levy says we can chat at SNL. Thanks. So you're going to meet with her. And then Greg Hickok responds, resecting left ATL does not cause word comprehension problems. And he has a quote, he has a citation with that, which I'm not going to click on right now, but you can click on that in the chat box for those of you who are interested in that.
Interesting. I mean, that's kind of mysterious under anyone's perspective. I mean, I feel like everyone would acknowledge that the ATL is doing something that supports, in the broadest possible sense, word comprehension. If you're incorporating access to, features of, semantic features or characteristics of objects in some form. So the fact that resection of ATL doesn't cause some kind of deficit that you could measure is actually surprising, and I think raises a lot of questions.
Thanks. I had put in a question earlier, and I see that a question from Julius Fredrickson is I think, related to that, at least in my mind. So I'm going to read both. So if it does turn out that Wernicke's area does indeed directly support both hierarchical syntactic computations and lexical computations, what do these types of computation have in common? Like, what do you think is the shared element that accounts for them being dependent on the same local regional support? So that was my question. And Julius asks, what do we know about other kinds of processing besides language that may be interrupted by damage to the temporal lobe areas your research identifies? For example, perception of biological motion may be one candidate. And what does that tell us about the kinds of computations that are supported by these regions?
So taking the second part first, yeah, definitely biological motion. And, that's very highly associated with STS. So I think the interesting question is to really drill down into the detailed functional anatomy and ask the question, are these really separate areas? My guess is that the biological motion area would be posterior to the linguistic one, but interesting question. I mean, there's not a lot that they have in common necessarily beyond the most broad things that are in common. So I think an interesting question, that overlap. Obviously, face processing, facial motion processing is important for language perception, but it's a pretty different animal from syntactic representations. The first part is, what's in common between words and syntax that this area is doing. So what we presented in the model was, it's not necessarily that all of syntax is there, but what is there are lexicalized syntactic representations. So we can think of this area as a linguistic storage area that stores, nodes that are relating form and meaning to each other and that are critically syntactic in some way. So with the lexicon, we typically talk about this idea of the lemma in psycholinguistics, and that's really, in some sense, the syntactic representation of a word. So the word cat, right, it's got multiple components to it, phonological, conceptual, but also has the fact that it's a noun that has other potential syntactic characteristics. Depending on the language, you've got gender information, that sort of thing. And so what I really think is going on is that this area is supporting those kinds of lexical representations, as well as stored treelets is sometimes the term that's used, or bits of syntactic structure that are like the sort of scaffolding of sentences that can be recombined, bits of phrases and clauses and some kind of syntactic features that are just basically the same kinds of information that you see on individual lexical items. And so I think there's a really further fascinating question to ask, which is, what's the finer grained organization within this area? Because there is some evidence that, so let me see if I can go back actually a few slides. Okay. This, I was looking back at this Fedorenko study from 2012, and oh God, it's way back here. Yeah, so here they find, right, like word versus non-word activation here, Jabberwocky sentence versus non-word activation here, right? And this is really a syntactic effect. And this is really a lexical semantic effect. They're highly overlapping, but what they did is they did multiple multivoxel pattern analyses, and they actually showed that this region will discriminate between, for example, the Jabberwocky and word conditions pretty effectively. And so it suggests that there really might be separate voxels, or voxels that are differently weighted towards conceptual or syntactic features. So these things might be kind of like interdigitized, but potentially separable within that region. So I'd be really curious to investigate that more deeply.
Great, thanks a lot. Meanwhile, there's a whole discussion that's going on in the chat box about what to resect and when not to resect.
No.
So I'm not going to do the voices, but I can quickly read out to you what the gist is. So R.G. Hillis says resection of stimulation of left posterior SCG does cause word comprehension deficits, or sorry, that emphasis was wrong. Resection of stimulation of left posterior STG does cause word comprehension deficits. See Lesser and colleagues. And then Greg Hickok says PPA typically involves both hemispheres, albeit asymmetrically, and that may explain differences compared to resection, which is unilateral. RG says also acute stroke in ATL does not affect word comprehension. Tzapkini and Hillis in brain, and it requires bilateral ATL damage to affect semantics, and that is also expressed by Kirana Tzapkini, who says you may need to resect both ATLs to have any semantic deficits, as Lamb and Ralph would suggest. Great talk, William, she also says. Do you want to respond to that, or shall I go to another question?
Well, just to keep the discussion going, I mean, I always find it weird to think you can damage or resect an area without seeing any deficits whatsoever. I mean, I want to know, what is the area doing? Is it completely redundant? And even if things are redundant, you might expect that to facilitate processing in some way, such that when you resect one side, you should see some kind of decrement to performance, whether that's in reaction time or a more complicated task. So I guess that result is great, right? Like, you know, I love Wernicke's area. It's my favorite area, but I'm still unsatisfied because I feel like resection of a big part of the brain should do something, you know? So I'm just curious what that should be.
Sure. So to change tacks a little, we have a question from Ben Palmer Welch. In terms of your model, where you integrate lexical and syntactic processing together in PMTG, I was wondering if you have encountered much evidence to suggest some degree of pragmatic and discourse-mediated syntactic processing within this area as well.
I guess I'm trying to fully understand the question. Not off the top, I haven't looked a lot at pragmatic or discourse kind of effects. So I guess the first thought I have is I don't really know the answer to your question, but I'm also trying to understand your question a bit more when you say syntactically mediated. I don't know if there's a clarification there.
Some degree of pragmatic and discourse mediated syntactic processing, so rather the other way around. Yeah. Discourse
mediated syntactic effects. Yeah, I guess I would need to hear some kind of further explanation, but off the top of my head, I haven't thought about that question too much.
I mean, as I interpret it, if that helps, I don't know, and I may be wrong, but then we can be corrected. I'm assuming it suggests that if lexical and syntactic processes are combined, like another level at which those processes come together is, of course, in discourse and pragmatics as well. Maybe garden path sentences, how you process, use heuristics to process things that are ambiguous. And so that's where syntax and lexical computations come together as well. So that's how I interpreted the question, and whether you found any, effects of those types of functions being.
Oh, yeah. So I guess maybe if you had a measure of discourse processing ability that wasn't explicitly lexical or syntactic, you'd be able to identify deficits or relationships with activation in that region. I mean, I think people have done this sort of work, but I really just am not super familiar with it myself. If anyone else has thoughts, please chime in with that. Yeah.
Okay. Then we have another question from Julius Fredrickson. Based on your results, would you argue for a language organ, region, as opposed to a language network? And by the way, great talk.
Well, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I was just really impressed with Stephen Wilson's talk, which I think is Sarah Schneck is the first author on that. I mean, it was a really striking result that it's hard to overinterpret a single result, a single study, but yeah, that activation in that area is really what predicted outcomes above and beyond lesion effect, not Broca's area, not ATL stuff, not parietal lobe. So it was just kind of an interesting comment that he made. It was like, this is the real language. This is the real language area, right? And, there's a part of me that absolutely loves it. And there's a part of me that's like, look, language is a multifaceted thing. You don't just think that there's a single area that does everything. All of the work from Eddie Chong, for example, on looking at ECOG and cortical stimulation of the STG, like there's definitely phonological processing stuff happening in the STG according to that research. And that's really separate spatially from the STS MTG stuff that we see for lexical and syntactic processing. And so I think that distinction, right, is pretty clear and pretty compelling. And depending on how you define language, the frontal cortex is certainly involved in something languagey. And I think, what Greg and I sort of went with, and I think it's congruent with other ideas, is like there's more domain general mechanisms that are recruited and specialized for language, but they still play this more of like a supporting role rather than really being the core linguistic representations themselves. So, I mean, kind of yes, in a sense, Julius, but I think there's got to be some functional anatomical specialization for different core aspects of language, like phonological, syntactic, semantic.
It seems to me there is a way to have your cake and eat it in this sense. If you compare, if you use an analogy where that language region is the sun, right? Our solar system is not just the sun, it's everything that is in there, and you only have the solar system if everything is in there. But without the sun, there's nothing, right? So it's like not a super hub, because that would suggest that it's just where things come together, but the main driver of everything that is language related. You might want to think about it like that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have this model here, right? And depending on what you call these things, right? Like if you think of language as the lexicon and syntax, then yes, we basically say that in this model, right? That this is the main area. But, there's plenty of evidence for some conceptual semantic function of the ATL and the angular gyrus. Like, I'm very interested in the resection sort of mystery there, right? But plenty of data from stroke-based aphasia, from PPA, from functional neuroimaging associates this region with some function that's relevant for, say, sentence comprehension or word level comprehension of some kind. And likewise, the frontal cortex is doing something. So yeah, I mean, I do in some sense think this area is like the magic area. I'm sorry, like I do agree, I feel like Stephen kind of alluded to that, and all the aphasia data, I think, point to that. And so there's other sources of data too that we could chat about. I do think this is really like, it is kind of funny, right? There's like this main area. Okay.
We have one, and I would say let's make this the final question for today. One final question by Ben Palmer Welch. In terms of, for example, no subject use in Spanish being mediated by topic and focus maintenance, for example, etc. I thought it might be interesting if you integrate the lexical and syntactic domains within this one area. Then there could be a means to explore a potential integration of syntactic and pragmatic processing here too. So that's a follow-up to the previous question.
Yeah, there are syntactic features that relate to these discourse markers and things like that. So that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of today's talk. Thank you, William. And thanks to the audience for sticking with us and for asking all your questions. And we're looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time for Brady Williamson's talk. Have a great weekend.